Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this webinar looking into the very topical subject of preparing for an increase of new projects seeking to connect to the grid. My name is Tom Luff, and I'm from the Energy Systems Catapult, and we're an independent innovation centre helping energy innovators create new projects and new products and services. Just before we start, just to sort of talk about the importance of this subject, and it's something that's really dear to our hearts in the Catapult. The electricity grid will be the backbone of our clean electricity and clean energy system, and making sure that new generation demand can connect in a timely manner is central to the country's energy objectives. But it's clear that the grid faces really challenging circumstances and perhaps more than ever before, and the sheer number of projects wanting to connect is eye-watering. And I think just in 2023-24 alone, the system operator received over 1,700 applications to connect to the transmission system. So it leaves more in the queue than are required for the energy system of 2030, let alone 2050. But we've got a really expert panel for you today, and we'll give you the latest insight on plans and reforms to allow faster connection to the grid. A key focus of today will be on grid infrastructure enhancements and the work underway to develop the first strategic spatial energy plan for the UK. So just in terms of the format for today, each speaker will have around 10 minutes to share their views on today's topic, and this will be followed up with discussion and audience Q&A. So please post your questions in the Q&A function in Zoom as we go through. I think you'll have seen that the webinar will be recorded, and this can be made available, or this will be made available after the webinar. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Jordan Deegan from Scottish and Southern Electricity Networks Transmission. So over to you, Jordan.
Perfect, thanks, Tom. Morning, everyone. So I'll just share my screen. This is a test of technology to see if it works, but just let me know if that's came through there, Tom.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, perfect, thanks. So yeah, as Tom mentioned, it's a very key topic of how we improve the connections process. So I'll give a bit of an introduction to myself. I'm Jordan Deegan. I'm the Senior Manager for the Connections team at SSE Transmission. So we're responsible for the technical economic analysis of any developers, generation or demand, and interface with DNO for any customer connections seeking connection to the transmission system in the north of Scotland. So before we get into the topic today, I thought it'd be quite useful to go back to how we actually plan connections today as a transmission operator. So fundamentally,
could you put it onto full screen, because it might make it just a little bit bigger? That'd be brilliant. That's possible. Thank you.
Perfect. Yeah. So fundamentally, all of our investment plans start with asset condition. We have to operate a safe and reliable network. So every price control period, we review the asset condition, and that fundamentally starts our investment plans and gives us signals from a non-load perspective of how we plan connections on the transmission network today. We then overlay the regional connection activity, so any generation and demand connections. We start to layer up what reinforcement options are most suitable for the current generation and background mix we have. We then look to tie that to the FES, the future energy scenarios that NESO, the system operator, publish every year. That's to give a bit more of a wider system context and tie that back to the regional connection activity. To get a bit more certainty, we then have our likely outturn assessment, which is developer intelligence around confidence of developers actually turning up, and then one key part of that, stakeholder feedback from the local communities around any reinforcement plans, and that's what makes up and summarise from any investment plans for the transmission network. Now, the kind of key variable to that is regional connection activity and kind of why we're here today. It's uncapped, uncontrolled, and we can receive a connection for a 1 megawatt embedded generator all the way up to a 3 gigawatt offshore wind farm. So that can change our plans quite significantly. And this is why we've seen the need for reform. The graph on the side shows a cumulative growth that we've seen over the last 4 to 5 years of applications received and clock started, i.e. applications we have to give a compliant offer for. We've seen a 3.5 to 4 times increase in the number of applications, whereas the transmission networks investment plans have kind of stayed the same. And on the right, we've seen the combined transmission and distribution queue has seen a sustained growth over the last year to 18 months. And NESO's recent pause letter for applications, that kind of alluded to the challenge here that we're seeing with the level of generation. Currently in the T&D tech queue, we've got more than enough generation and demand to meet the 2030 and our longer term 2050 net zero ambitions. So this is making current proposals under the connections application process today very difficult to tie and give investment security and signals to market around confident investment signals. So I thought it'd be quite useful to touch on a recent example we've had. So in quite a remote area of a network, we received an application for a wind farm onshore to connect to our transmission system. Due to the limited amount of infrastructure in that area, it was a relatively straightforward and quite standard solution we proposed, i.e. we build a 132 kV overhead line out to that user and install the metering infrastructure to connect that user. As I said, due to the limited infrastructure, it's relatively simple and straightforward. It also, due to the current contracted and background generation at these sites, it also triggered the need for a third supergrid transformer to interconnect with the main transmission system. That's all well and good. The current developer behind that is unconsented, but we still have to provide a compliant offer. Around 18 months later, we then received another application for an onshore wind farm in the kind of vicinity of that one as well. That then has, as I said earlier, due to the limited infrastructure in that area, not many options are available that are cost effective to the developer and to the GB consumer. So we proposed a solution that interacted with the current contracted developer, which obviously was 18 months contracted, and we had this project in the pipeline. This significantly changed the design. It changed the need for the 132 kV overhead line back to our substation, which changed the tower types. It also triggered the need for a substation extension and an additional SGT to connect to the transmission network and provide the thermal capability to connect all of that generation in that area. In the backdrop of all of this, we've also got to assess the demand in that local area and our interfaces with our distribution customers, assess any growth that may be in that area. So this simple example highlights the problem with the current process today, that we assess each developer on a case-by-case basis. We don't have a plan that's government-backed or aligned to strategic need of the GB energy system that allows us to drive these solutions. We could have another connection in another 18 months that fundamentally changes this, and we can just never give certainty to developers looking to make financial investment decisions to drive this forward and connect clean power to our transmission network. So as I say, this highlights one of the key issues we have today with the current planning process, and this highlights the gap in how our process today as transmission owners is for planning connections to the transmission system. This is where the need for a spatial energy plan comes in and is key for us giving security and key investment decisions to developers looking to connect, because we remove the front end uncertainty by having a plan that we can align developer connections to, that's government backed, and it's also strategically aligned with GB energy needs. So we effectively get an energy plan with different vectors within that aligns all as I said, the government targets. We then take that plan and we can then overlay and take a network-driven solution. So this is what Connections Reform is really looking to do. We don't do it on a case-by-case basis anymore. We get a batched assessment at the front end. We then strategically align that with a spatial energy plan, and that allows us to give certainty to developers. And also, in terms of the way we engage with the regulator, it also allows us to tie our investment cases back to a government-backed plan and gives more security in terms of the decisions we need to make as a transmission owner, given the ability for clean power to connect to our network for 2030 and beyond to meet our net zero ambitions. So the first iteration in the need for a spatial energy plan is as probably we're all aware, is the Clean Power 2030 plan, which DESNZ recently just published their opinion on. And this is what, for connections reform, there'll be 2 pathways, and we'll have to strategically align to Clean Power 2030 or a 31 to 35 pathway. And the graph on the left-hand side shows the growth and the need for us to connect generation in the north of Scotland. But as I touched on at the beginning, that's quite difficult in the past if we don't have a plan to align to. We're driven by uncapped and uncontrolled developer connections, whereas we can now take a batched assessment during a 4 to 5 month period, overlay that against a government plan and give network solutions that are compliant and give long-term investment security decisions for developers. So this is the first step in terms of what we'll do for connections reform that's due to go live Q2 this year. Building on our kind of RIIO-T3 business plan that was published at the back end of last year, this is again giving us another layer of certainty for reinforcement proposals. We have a pathway to 2030 projects that are fundamentally driven by offshore wind projects, but we now have an additional layer and a plan that we can now align strategic connections to that, and gives us certainty, and it allows us to effectively, at the beginning of our connections process, outline what the ceiling is for the network, and then make a system plan that aligns with that ceiling, whereas before it's effectively back to front. So Clean Power 2030 is a key initiative, and the connections reform and a key building block, and effectively the first iteration in a long-term enduring strategic spatial energy plan that allow us as transmission owners to give confidence to the industry that what we are proposing is certain. So I'll briefly touch on where we are today with connections reform, and the other panelists will go through that in potentially a bit more detail. But back in 2023, the TMO4+ reform proposals were launched by NESO with TO and DNO input to that. We've then had the cost commods raised for CMP 435 and 434, which is the gate 2 to whole queue reassessment that will be undertaken Q2 to Q4 this year. Effectively, we'll review all connections that are currently contracted in a batched window and align those to 2 strategic plans, giving certainty to developers. That, as we were developing the connection network design methodologies, the Clean Power 2030 plan was then announced kind of halfway through that. So that allowed us to kind of then give a bit more certainty around those proposals and what we were doing. And where we are today is NESO have just recently announced a pause on all new applications and any modification applications, because we're about to transition into a new process to allow us to give clarity to developers. And if we are kind of touching on the slide at the beginning, if we're still seeing a sustained 400 or 500 connection applications each year, it becomes very difficult to then, one, set up the processes that we have internally, align with industry, and then do that assessment period from Q2 onwards this year to give certainty to market around what we're proposing to reinforce the transmission system in the north of Scotland. So, as I say, the decision from Ofgem is expected Q1 this year, and we'll get a minded to position from Ofgem in that period as to what they plan to do with the proposals that the energy system operators propose. But if we get the green light, then from a TO perspective, from Q2 onwards, we'll be looking to set up our internal processes to allow us to streamline and start to review the current connections queue and align that to a strategic plan to give certainty to meet the Clean Power 2030 targets in the first instance. But I'll stop there, Tom, and let you pass on to Richard.
Thank you very much, Jordan. Really, really great overview. Just to say, we won't be taking questions initially, but we'll take them at the end. So please post in the Q&A if you do have questions as we go through, so we can gather them. So yes, our next speaker, Richard Woodward, Connections Reform Senior Manager at National Grid. So I'll hand over to you, Richard. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tom. So I'm here representing National Grid, the electricity transmission bit of the business, the England and Wales transmission owner. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we're setting up our business into the next price control period to try to facilitate the level of connections that investment is keen to see, but also talk to some of the policy angles that Jordan has raised there and give a perspective on that as well. That's the aspect of this work that is close to my heart and my team's heart. We've been lobbying for this for some time. And think when I started, I had a full head of hair, and look where we are now. Change, a common variable in our sector, uncertainty on all sides of the fence. But certainly for the first time in a while, it feels like there's some actual strategic direction, some energy policy direction that is underpinning everything. And I think it's really critical, really. I think we have got a lot of experts in this sector, but a lot of maybe confusing signals. And I think the situation we find ourselves with the connections market is perhaps a case of the arrangements, the market's evolving at such a rapid pace that the kind of legislative regulatory arrangements that underpin them have not been able to keep pace. And for the first time, I think that race is a little bit more even-handed now. So I'll talk more about that to kind of close out. But just to explain what in NGET we are thinking about in the upcoming T3 Rio period, which spans April 26 through March 31. We published our draft plan to Ofgem in December this year. It's now out for, I think, a call for evidence. That closes in February, and then we're expecting draft determinations through June and final determinations in December this year. And that sets, obviously, the investment signal for us to an extent from the regulator in terms of what we can spend. And currently our levels of investment are up to 35 billion, and that's including 11.4 of baseline funding and 23.7 billion of pipeline projects across all areas of our network. But there are other factors that we need to consider too. Of course, it's important that we can support the connection of generation. Our plan in reference currently to FES 2024 on the holistic pathway scenario looks to connect 35 gigawatts of new generation. We're also looking at 19 gigavar of demand connections as well, the likes of gigafactories and data centers. So clearly the connection of developer projects is front and center for a lot of what we're doing, but also we need to ensure that we maintain reliability. We have a world-leading reliability of 99.9% reliability. And I think all of us would expect that to be maintained. You can't trade off connecting projects with losing that reliability. So we're keen to maintain that. We're also keen to avoid constraint costs. We've got solutions that will hopefully avoid 12 billion of constraint costs, which I think is the equivalent of about £40 per year for consumer bills. So all of these kind of agendas that we have as a transmission owner, as a licensed monopoly, we have to factor into our plans. And I think certainly we are now trying to consider what the connection reform outcome, the mission control aspects, the Clean Power 2030 aspects, leading into SEP, lead us to consider that demand to connect into our network and making sure that those connections are there. So what are we doing to kind of dovetail in our kind of regulatory and funding mechanisms with connecting your projects? So Jordan's really helpfully set the scene for connections reform. In England and Wales, in our TO region, the contracted pipeline currently sits at 400 gigawatts, which, according to our analysis, is 3 times more than we would have ever expected to connect under even the most demanding scenarios out to 2050. So for us, reform is long overdue. And I think for developers, for investors, I think it is as well. Certainly for reform, that oversubscribed connection queue needs to be cut right down. We're really keen and supportive of the inclusion of the existing pipeline in the TMO4 arrangements and hope that Ofgem will endorse that through their determination process. We support at the moment the need for a pause. We believe that connection applications during this time of change with the TOs, the NESO, and also our DNO colleagues trying to grapple with these new arrangements, these new policy arrangements, trying to do that internal implementation that Jordan talked about is important. The same people that will be dealing with applications as they come in at the moment will be the same people that need to be trained up to manage applications and offers through the reform process. So we need to give them that space to be able to not only understand what new processes look like, but also give some stability to that contracted background. We're really keen that obviously the TMO4 solution factors readiness. I think that is something that we've started to see a little bit more over the last few years. Queue management. Some of you will be aware of the ENA kind of led work that concluded in a CUSC mod proposal, CMP 376, that started to have a little bit more of an objective measure of project progression, and ensured that projects remain on track, and took action where that wasn't the case. But still, as Jordan mentioned, the entry point, the application process kind of continued unabated, and therefore we think it's really important that TMO4 factors readiness. It considers aspects such as a developer's access to land to build the project they need. It's a proportionate package of land for the project they intend to build, but also considers wider aspects such as planning as well. And we're I think, supportive of the NESO, including the consideration for DCO projects to be able to demonstrate their readiness through planning. But I think, as Jordan mentioned, that the inclusion of strategic alignment, that tying back to the connection arrangements, facilitating government energy direction, is massive for us. We've been really clear through our engagement and lobbying through the TMO4 process that readiness alone was not going to bring down the volume of the contractor background and enable us as a TO to focus our resources to where it's needed, but also enable the investor community to understand where the opportunities to build projects lies. And so we're really happy that the inclusion of the strategic alignment piece for the Gate 2 criteria was added in, and that the reference ties back to a government endorsed target that will evolve, I'm sure, over time from CP30 through to SSEP, but sets that really strong direction. And I get that as a developer community that moved at quite a pace. I'm not sure any of us are used to the pace at which the TMO4 connections reform solution evolved. That doesn't mean that it's evolving in the wrong direction, but we need to obviously understand it. And I think we get that reform isn't going to be a panacea, and I think we need to understand and operate and live with it and optimize it as we get used to it. But from a TO perspective, just to kind of advocate for the kind of positions that Jordan was setting out previously, that stability for us is really crucial. Without a steer of which projects are the most viable, which have the readiness, which have the strategic alignment, etc., we are essentially considering things in a piecemeal manner. We are investing on the basis of customers who have a contract and assuming they're going to fulfill that contract, and often that isn't the case. So our ability to make investments in an optimized strategic manner is really diminished. So our hope through reform is that we're able not only to compile and batch our investments, but that leads to optimization through the supply chain. That is a real challenge I think all of us see, but not least for us onshore TOs and our DNO colleagues, that supply chain. And being able to line that up in advance, having sight of an end point or at least a target point into the future, the ability to combine that with certainty for developers and their projects, the certainty that if a project falls out of the queue because of reasons that happen and crop up all the time, then another project will take its place and maintain that investment signal, that viability signal to us is massive. And really the hope for us in the short term is that we can start to manage our pipeline with much more certainty, and also give time back to you guys as developers such that we can walk you or handhold you through the project development cycle. It's something that we haven't done at the moment. The volume of applications that we've talked about means we become very reactive. We don't allow a huge amount of time for our people because we can't, to actually work with you to get your project from cradle to grave to completion. And so our hope is that we free up our team's time to actually be that partner with you, that construction partner, that project manager with you, such that we manage issues in a much better fashion. But longer term, from an investor perspective, as Jordan alluded to, the opportunity there is being able to proceed and consider investment opportunities with more certainty. The targets are there, the capacity limits and where capacity and certain technologies should be connected is now publicly available information. It's not something that you guys need to speculate on. And so I think whilst I know that the extent of the opportunity in the market appears to be contracting, actually what is out there now is an opportunity to be much more focused, much more considerate, and to enable us as the networks to connect you in a much more collaborative and considered way. So of course there will be some bumps in the road. Of course we've got to navigate the next period of the T3 business plan submission and Ofgem determinations in a considerate way that factors the evolutions of these new policy directions as much as it can. But hopefully the summary there I've provided gives you an idea of the kind of things that as NGET we're setting ourselves up for in the next few months, and the kind of things that you guys can expect to see certainly towards the end of the year as we implement this to the existing queue, but through 2026 and onwards through to 2030, and the ambitious but achievable targets that the government's Mission Control and Clean Power 2030 direction sets for all of us. So that's all I have, Tom.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Thank you, Richard. And just to flag again, quick questions, please keep coming. Great to see some already there. We'll take them once we've gone through all the speakers. So moving on to our next speaker, Grant Rogers, Head of Grid at Qualitas Energy. Look forward to hearing what you have to say. Grant, over to you.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks to Richard and Jordan for sort of laying the land for me a little bit. I'm coming from a different direction. Obviously, those guys have come from the transmission perspective. I'm coming more from a developer perspective. No slides. I'm doing off the cuff, much like Richard. So I'm going to go point by point on what we looked at in the three sort of header points in the Zoom meeting. So first and foremost, they would identify network reinforcement needed to support higher volume of applications. I would probably challenge whether there would be a higher volume of applications following the reform. I think there's a lot of uncertainty, and my personal view is there's unlikely to be the same volumes. As Tom mentioned, you're looking at 1,700 applications to transmission, which is wild in the sort of connection space. For a bit of background, I used to work as a system planner for the DNO, and even at the DNO, that would seem like a crazy number of applications, let alone transmission. I don't see that continuing with the uncertainty and risk that the new process is proposed to developers. Jordan did a really good, Jordan did a really good overview of the complications with the connections process and reinforcing ahead of need, for want of a better description. I still think that there's complication with that, because even though we now have POTS and we have a clear view, as Richard said, as to what is wanted and needed within the UK energy space, there's an assumption that will be delivered by the existing pipeline and new pipeline. However, there's every chance that a particular area of generation or proposed generation won't deliver. So not enough wind in one of the wind pots, not enough solar in one of the solar pots, or locationally not deliver. That would technically adjust where you would look to reinforce. I assume, and this is an assumption from my side, that the TOs will be looking to lean on the FES heavily and work they've already done. And that leads us into the complication. Another point that Richard made, which is a fair point, that ideally now, if there is attrition, there will be a site behind that one that fails to replace it. But that's almost too much of a perfect world, I guess, to describe, because that would assume there is a question's just come up. That would assume that there is a development sitting there being invested in the background to then replace that one that falls away, which just I don't see happening. So in terms of where that reinforcement is going to go, I think we can just lean on the FES for now, but also accept that there's likely to be a set path between the transmission operators that they're looking to work to, and that is somewhat set in stone, partly to do with a pause as well. So we have the pause, not ideal for developers. I think I can't see any of you, so I'm kind of talking to myself right now, but I assume many developers on the call will have been thrown a little bit by the pause, but I think there's an understandable need for that from the transmission operators' perspective and NESO's perspective, in that they need to draw a line in the sand somewhat to know where they currently stand with the existing queue, take into consideration those are looking to get into that gated process that meet the new criteria, which is still a relatively low bar, and then develop the network on that basis. I'm assuming building in some attrition possibly. So in terms of how they'll identify that network reinforcement requirement, that would be how I think they will do it. Obviously, I'm not working for the network operators anymore, so I can't know that for sure. But without doing something along those lines, I think it'd be very difficult to adjust your plan as things move on. The pause sets out that there is a network that's required for the future. These are the pots. These are what we think these are the applications that have got through gate 2 or propose to get through gate 2. And I believe they'll look to plan on that basis, and there'll be little room to adjust from there. I could be wrong, and I'll happily sort of discuss that in the Q&A if there's different views from the TOs. So that wraps up where I think the identifying network reinforcement sits. Other than the DNO requirement as well, another complication of that is the DNOs also have their own applications, which then will feed into the requirements of gate 2. They have their own pots, which may or may not deliver or may over-deliver, which will then adjust that reinforcement requirement going forward. Again, attrition would technically adjust that unless they set those pots for future. And that is essentially saying this area here will have X amount of megawatts or X amount of gigawatts, and that will always be the case. And they just want the investment to deliver, essentially. It could work, but it could also be that they've proposed an area of requirement for wind or solar that just doesn't work from a planning aspect, from a land aspect. That remains to be seen, and I think that's where there'll be complications as to where that network reinforcement actually will be going and will be needed. I'll move on to the next point. I'll rattle through this, by the way, because I think there's been a lot of good points, and it'll just open up the Q&A towards the end, which I think will be useful. Progress with the new connections process and plans for implementation. This also throws up a lot of questions and uncertainty for developers. There's enough uncertainty as it was without the pause. The pause itself isn't the uncertainty. I think the adjustment of the timescale as a result of that pause, I think, is. NESO stated this week in one of their webinars that they could not confirm there would actually be 2 gates this year. So I think everyone from the developer perspective was assuming the new processes would align with a gated process. 2 gates a year, you miss the first gate, you get into the second gate. That seems a little bit thrown right now. So the progress is kind of stalled or kind of been thrown, adjusted at least. If you're a developer right now, I think it's very difficult to know where you stand. You can push, if you have an exit, for example, we're looking at new connections. The first point here was new applications. I think if you're a new applicant, you're in a very difficult position because you have no idea when you'll get clarity on your connection. This is in some ways, the proposed process is an improvement, because you could argue as a DNO customer, particularly, you would come in and have your TIA process, or for want of a better, a wrap-up description of the project progression process. You would come into a DNO, get your connection offer, but still have an unknown from your transmission works requirement, and that could take any amount of time. There was stories of that process for project progression taking 12 months or more in some DNOs. That isn't the case now. However, there still is a case of a delay and an unknown for those applying right now. And for those in the queue now, there's delay and unknown until the end of this year to have any clarity on where you can or can't connect. Obviously, you're holding an investment in that land. You're committing time and money and funds to that and manpower to that particular project without having any clarity on it. So the process, while it's an improvement, there is this middle ground right now where there isn't any clarity for anyone. I think the pause particularly has thrown a little bit of panic into the industry. Is it being implemented at the right pace? I think it was a really tough job for NESO and everyone within the industry to make this work at such a short time span. They're doing the best they can. I think the progress should be applauded, but it isn't as clear cut as it's being proposed, in that it makes things easier for investment. It doesn't right now. It will eventually, but right now there are far, far too many unknowns to say that there's confidence in investment for those looking to progress, even an existing connection or looking to apply right now. And then I'll move on to the SSEP. So this one has more confusion linked to it from a developer perspective, I believe, but also, again, the flip side of that is eventually it will add clarity. The SSEP is looking to take into account the RESPs. The RESPs themselves are proposed to be influenced by both the DNOs, local authorities, proposing what requirements they need in that area from, I believe, it's up to 2030 and 2030 beyond. The RESPs are looking to propose those, inform the DNO business plans at the end of 2025 into 2026, which again then throws into the question where there is a need for reinforcement, where they're identifying a reinforcement need ahead. That is after the gated process is already rolling for at least a year. Again, that leaves an unknown as to whether that will then be adjusted on the back of the RESPs. Eventually, that will add clarity. But right now, it just adds further confusion from my perspective for investment and for developers. All of this pulled together, from a developer perspective, right now there's a lot of uncertainty. The proposal will lead into certainty, but in that middle ground, it's very hard to see how, as a developer and an investor, you can wade this path or run this path and know where you're going. We're all going very blind currently. Knowing where to go, I think, is very difficult. And I think once the clarity comes out, it will make things a lot easier for investment for right now. And from a developer perspective, it isn't there. There's also another, I guess, my wider point on terms of existing pipeline, and I think the lean on that. A couple of times it's been mentioned that there's more than enough in the queue. A point I've made, I mean, anyone that's seen me in the industry would say I bang this point home on repeat, is that the assumption that the queue is enough assumes that everything in the queue is real, with the bar being so low for applications, both at DNO, but particularly at TO, 1,700 apps, 700 plus gigawatts, or between Scotland and England and Wales, just illustrates that there's likely to be a very high amount of attrition in that. And there's more than likely a need or a reliance on new applicants coming through. The assumption that the queue is big enough assumes the queue will be delivered, and that really isn't likely to be the case. So the lack of clarity for new applicants, I think, is a problem and something that will need to be addressed pretty quickly. And that is where the SSEP technically would help longer term. But until that clarity is given, there is a gap in between where there is no clarity. If there's a higher volume of applications, it's going to be very difficult for those applicants to know what they're doing. And it's very difficult for the TOs and DNOs to deal with a higher volume of applications in the current processes. The DNOs themselves are not adjusting their processes and not pausing currently. So DNO applications will continue to rise up, which will again influence where or when the reinforcement is needed, depending on when those DNOs propose that updated requirement to the TOs within the gated process updates. And again, a lot of confusion there as to where that will be needed. So wrapping up, I guess, in my very rapid, I think mine's been about 5 minutes. I think that's enough anyway of my monotone, is that there's a lot of uncertainty and risk. And while the proposals will create some clarity in time, in the interim, I think it's very difficult for applicants to know where they're going, whether they're an existing applicant looking to progress or a new applicant wondering where they should be looking to apply. The clarity, while on paper, seems like it's there. It just isn't quite yet. And that's me for now. Any questions I'll take later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Grant. And yeah, as Grant mentioned, yeah, please keep the questions coming in, and we can either try and answer them as we go, or we'll pick them up in the Q&A. And yeah, just to flag, you can put the questions in either anonymously if you like, or you can put in with your name there. So we've heard from grid companies, we've heard from developer now, and now looking at kind of perspective of company providing balancing services. So our next speaker is Hafiz Milhan, and he's from Statera, grid connection manager there. So really looking forward to hearing your perspective, and I'll hand over to you now, Hafiz.
Thanks, Tom. Hopefully you guys can hear me okay.
Yes, good. Yeah.
So yeah, I think coming last means I have less things to talk about because I think everyone's covered all the points pretty well. Yeah, I mean, especially thanks, Grant. I think from a developer point of view, you covered a lot of the issues we face as well. So as a developer and someone who participates in balancing the grid as well, owners of energy, we face most of the same issues that Grant has pointed out. But I think again, going through about the reformation process, for me, the main thing is currently, because the pause and NESO and the TOs, DNOs figuring things out, there's a lot of uncertainty for us. And a big part of what we do right now is assuring the investors to make sure, this is our plan. But I think the view we've taken is with sort of every change and every difficulty comes opportunity as well. So trying to figure out where the opportunity is. So I mean, I used to work for ESO, which is now the NESO, which is now NESO. So I think one of the first things when I came and figured out how projects were sort of started, I was a little bit surprised because, it's like connect and manage. So they look for, where we can find land, where you can find planning easily, and then that's where projects used to be invested in. So, personally and as a company, we welcome the changes in sort of looking at it strategically and holistically as well. And what we're trying to see is to look at projects that can be helpful towards, the need of the grid and need of the system. So, so I think that's where the opportunity comes to try and pick projects that we think, looking at what are the requirements in terms of, voltage needs, capacity market arrangements, what kind of technology is required, and like Jason said, I think they've published everything in the website, so all publicly available information. But I think in terms of progressing it and network reinforcement, a very important point that sort of Grant mentioned is that it's assumed that the queue will deliver. And I think from my interaction, I've got this stat that apparently 30% of projects only deliver. So if you have 1,700 applications, this is from the past, only 30% of the 30% of those projects would deliver. So obviously with the new queue reformation, that's going to get better, but it's still not going to be 100%. So I think a big aspect also missing is sort of assessment of deliverability of projects. So we know there are a lot of companies that sort of get land rights and get planning and then sort of delay the developing process or look to sell off to a developer. And then there are issues in, getting the required network reinforcement work done. So there are a lot of delays there as well. So in terms of deliverability of these projects, I don't think there are any assessments, especially if there is a project that would retain its position in the queue and another one gets bounced back, then, which would potentially be easier to deliver, then I don't think there is sort of a fair way of assessing that and managing that as well. And again, going back to what Grant mentioned, it's difficult to think that when a project falls back, then another project can take its place because, in terms of equipment, there's long lead times and you would have, ordered things to come at a particular time. You would have made commitments at a particular time. So it's not easy to move those around. Then you need, you need to get the outages coordinated and all that stuff to deliver it. So I think that's a big part that I feel is missing from this connection reformation, and a vital part from our point of view. And like you said, I think this period of 2025 is going to be uncertain, but I think from our point of view, we hope there will be more certainty afterwards, because even in the current process, there's a lot of uncertainty because we have connection offers that have been made by the TOs and the ESO, NISO. But when we go back and try to delve into the details, then it comes across that some of these offers were made, but without a lot of commitment to it. For example, we've had projects where we've confirmed we're getting this bay at this site or something like that, and at this time, but then later we've been told, oh, this bay has been given to someone else, or we have to wait for the substation to be extended. So there's a lot of uncertainty around those as well. So I hope by sort of this reformation and by projects being picked more carefully, that there'll be more certainty for us in the long term as well. So I think, yeah, we're hopeful that there'll be more certainty in that perspective, especially when we have projects with long lead times that we need to order in and make sure that they align with what's been envisaged. Like, for example, if we have a huge connection, then we say, okay, we can only get half that capacity right now, but we've got these equipment sitting there. Then yeah, it's not great for us as developers as well. So I'm hoping that by eliminating some of these ghost projects and that issues with equipment would also ease up potentially. And resources, I think, like more engagement with NGT and the other TOs and NISO as well would be possible, so that we can move the application process and connection process more swiftly. I think another issue that I want to talk about was about when adapting new ways in terms of the strategic spatial plan in determining new projects, because they talk about designated projects that could be like useful for the operability or for the network. So I think that's where I think companies would like more clarity on. I think the understanding for us is that NISO would publish what are the requirements in certain areas, and then projects will be able to bid for this. But that is where we would like more clarity, so that we can make better arrangements and plan ahead and look at viable solutions for these opportunities in the system. So designated projects, one of the main things I want to talk about. And in terms of strategic spatial planning, because it's applied across the UK evenly, rather than or holistically, rather to say, we're hoping it will be more consistent. There'll be a consistent approach for the developers in looking at viable projects. So then we have more certainty when we go to investors saying, we think this will happen because it's happened elsewhere, and there's some consistent approach in assessing these projects. So I think that's where we sit, trying to look at what are the opportunities in terms of the new structure and the new reformation process, looking at what Gate 1, Gate 2 would look like, and how we can navigate this new uncertain times. Thanks, Tom. I think that's me.
Thank you very much. Really helpful. We've now come through all the speakers, and we've come to Q&A. Very usefully, one of the questions already posed has been answered. So thank you for that. But please do keep questions coming in. I think we heard some common themes, some really interesting themes around the real importance of strategic alignment. Aligned ultimately to what's needed for the country. So the recent government and NISO plans very helpful. But also talk about the need for certainty for developers, and need the confidence to keep developing, and a question of do we have that? I think we heard about the size of the queue and how big that queue is, but also kind of questions to how likely it is that the queue will ultimately deliver. And are we being complacent there? So potential further discussion there. And I think overall a real feeling of pace, and pace being a really necessary thing at this point to be driving these changes through. So I'm going to pose a question to, I guess, all of the panel to start with. So perhaps if the panel can come back and come back on screen, that'd be great. I guess maybe two kind of questions to all to start with. One is how do we make sure that the connection reform process is fair for all the different interests? And I know that's probably quite a big question, but kind of what would be the guiding principles from your perspectives? And then maybe just on top of that, if you can, the question about whether the queue will deliver. Are we, there's a huge queue out there. What sort of sense do you have as to whether that's going to be, whether we can rely on that, or whether that might fall away? So should we start in the order that we had the presentation? So maybe Jordan, then Richard, and then Grant, and then Hafiz.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks. I'll probably start with, I think the queue question around whether it's sufficient to deliver. I think it is a good question. I think the problem we have at the minute is it's driving uncertain reinforcement needs, and it's also, I take battery storage for example. The the surge we've seen in transmission connected battery storage over the last 18 months to 2 years is really been significant and really outweighs the capacity limit that's been assigned to us in Clean Power 2030. I think the barrier to entry at the minute's too low. So we'll obviously see a bit of attrition, and I think it's then taking stock as to see what is remaining in the queue for the gate 2 to whole queue process to see, is it enough of a triage? Because I think from a TO perspective, what we really want to see is true projects come through that process and drive competition in that sense, because from a planning perspective and a system planning perspective, we obviously want to propose network reinforcements that are low regret. So I think it was Grant mentioned around that obviously there's talk around capacity shifting in terms of if you are undersupplied in one kind of regional area for your Clean Power 2030 plan, how do you just make that up? I think from our perspective, there's obviously going to be nuances in the terms of how you connect that single generator, but I think what we want from a TO perspective is to deliver reinforcements that are very low risk and low regret to the GB consumer at the end of the day. So we propose something that's connected into the MITS, the main interconnected transmission system, that is quite interchangeable. It's obviously the connection assets out to the users. So I think the queue is a big one. I think, as I say, just to kind of wrap up, it's skewing our investment needs at the minute. It's also disproportionately applied across the network. As I say, we have pockets of our network that are predominantly battery and no true generation. So it's again lining to a strategic plan of getting the right balance and mix so that we have always provide energy security. So I think it's a good question. I think at the minute it's one of those ones we have to see what the attrition does in terms of the gate 2 to whole queue process this year, and then review what's left in the queue. And I think it's also been proactive moving forward as well to make sure that barrier to entry is sufficiently high so that we don't just end up in the same position we are today in terms of like ghost projects and still enter the queue and make it effectively skew what we're looking at from an investment proposal. So I think, yeah, it's a key one, and I think it's one of those, we've moved at pace, so there will be bumps and there will be errors within the processes, but I think it's refinement, always striving to improve that and taking kind of lessons learned. Like when we go through this process and the latter stage of this year, it's not going to be perfect. I don't think anyone in the industry is selling it as that is going to be the silver bullet to all problems. But I think it's a step in the right direction, and then it's just continued refinement on top of that. And as we get further out into the planning horizon and start to integrate and develop more of the strategic spatial energy plan, I think it just adds additional layers and security and confidence from a TO perspective. Because I think if we are driving reinforcement needs that are underpinned and backed by government and regulation and Ofgem, it then gives security and confidence to the developer market, and then in my view personally, I think it then drives the right competition in the developer market to connect to the transmission network.
Thank you, Jordan. That's really helpful. On to Richard, and I know that Grant and Hafiz will have they're itching to come in, so if you could keep it relatively quick, Richard.
I'll be economic and efficient as per my license conditions. Just to briefly supplement Jordan's point there on will we have enough? Will the queue fit the caps? I think was the underlying question, wasn't it? As I understand it, the NESO and Ofgem are working really closely to try and analyse that as part of making Ofgem's determinations. So I think there's Ofgem are looking for that reassurance too, and are asking the right questions of NESO to be able to proceed with some confidence on making those approvals. So I'm not seeing that data. I'm not part of that process as a T. I'm not the NESO anymore. But I think that's part of Ofgem's consideration. So that is occurring as far as I'm aware. In terms of the other aspect of the question, Tom, on fairness, this is something that's really important, at least from my perspective, having advocated for policy reform as a TO. Fairness at the moment, I think, is very difficult to see in the current arrangements because there are no real barriers to entry. The motivation to apply for a project is, can you at least assuming a lowest common denominator consideration of investment is, can I pay my application fee, and have I done it at the right time to be able to be at front of the queue, and then can I stay there and make my, this is the world that currently the arrangements are facilitating, which to me is eminently unfair and is not effective in terms of competition. So the world of TMO4 has much more objective criteria to participate in the market, which I think is fair as a starting point. the key then is that those arrangements are facilitated transparently. I know that industry have got some concerns about the supporting methodologies and the ability for them to understand and control and change those. I think the NISO put in place with Ofgem a lot of guidelines and supporting governance to help with that. But I think it's on the NISO as now an independent government body to be able to justify and stand up in front of industry that they are equipped to facilitate those arrangements and do so in a fair way. And I think transparency is critical for that. So I think we're all keen to see that.
Thank you. Grant, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I'll try and keep it quick too. I think Richard wrapped up the fairness point quite well. I think inherently nothing's ever equally fair, but it's going to be fairer in the new world. There will still be some unfairness there, I think, or there's a risk of it to particular parties. That's just life, I think, isn't it? You can't make it perfect. But in discussing that fairness and the low bar being unfair, I think that highlights, I guess, where I come from on the attrition numbers is, to give you a bit of background, I work in, and I have worked in investment in renewables for quite a while, so we get to see what's up for sale, for want of a better description. And I'm ever the pessimist as to what those attrition values are going to be, and I will remain to be in this until I'm proven wrong. For reasons I can't divulge, but essentially there is, even without seeing behind that sort of cloak a little bit, I think the point Richard makes is that that bar was so low, and the view was just get your queue position and sell that connection for so long. That more than anything should point to the attrition rates are going to be high. I'm a little bit wary that the new bar is too low because it relies on queue management, which I think is a great way of doing things, but also that horse has kind of bolted a little bit in terms of the timescales. I don't know how that can be addressed. Maybe the financial instrument, which I think makes people wary, but I also see logic to it as well, because if you're saying you're committed to build the site, then you should have some sort of finances to back that, to put down up front, because you're committing to cancellation charges in a year or two anyway. I know others don't agree with that. I can see why in terms of the numbers that are being proposed right now. But yeah, in terms of lowering that attrition rate without some sort of, as the term goes, skin in the game, I think there's still a risk of that attrition being a lot higher than everyone thinks, even after the gated process. I think the gated process will weed out some, but people are scrambling to get. Last point, people had connections with no land, they just gone in blind, and then now they're scrambling to get land to fit a connection that isn't a connection that's going to work. That's throwing mud at the wall. A connection should have had land in the first place and been properly planned before they applied. But I get that those who were looking to properly plan were worried that someone would jump in front of them, so they also jumped in quickly. So okay. Yeah, attrition will be high, I think, is my overall view. Sorry.
Thank you. And Hafiz.
Thanks, Tom. I think in terms of fairness, I think they've addressed it quite well. So I think I touched upon it as well. I think clarity is the first thing. There is clarity in what is required and how it's going to be assessed. Each projects, especially designated projects, which is like the special projects, basically how they are going to be selected, and then consistent approach, how they are consistently applied to all the projects, and finally transparency in what's going on. I think that's the only way to make sure there's some sort of fairness in the process. But yeah, I mean, I agree with Grant. It seems to be like there's going to be some winners, some losers, and in the past it was just connect and manage, so unfairly advantaging projects that had just land. But right now that is balancing it somewhat. So. Yeah. And in terms of sort of,
I think just a very, very quick one on that one, because we're just coming up to time.
Yeah, sure. In terms of deliverability, I think I already mentioned you need to assess deliverability, and I think attrition will be high as well, like Grant. And if you can, have some sort of way of assessing this deliverability and how serious projects are, and having sort of more commitment from all sides, then I think that'll be better. So.
Thank you. Well, really great perspectives and a good mix of views there. But I think definitely a sense that we're all working together on this one. Thank you, everyone, for first, thanks very much to the panel. Thank you to the audience for listening, and thank you very much to Waterfront for hosting. Just to mention, the Connecting Projects to the Grid 2025 is being launched and will take place on the 26th of June at Aldersaw Goddard in London. So an email will be sent out for further details of this regarding that event by Waterfront after the webinar. And so, yeah, just to say many thanks again, and we'll close there. So thank you.
Cheers, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks all.
Thank you.